Power rarely recognizes its own limits when it is still expanding. It reads distance as reach, territory as control, and compliance as permanence. The contradiction is not that power fails to extend itself, but that extension alters the conditions under which it can still be exercised. What appears as growth often reorganizes the structure of authority into something slower, less responsive, and increasingly dependent on assumptions it can no longer verify. The British Empire did not encounter its limit on land as a sudden resistance. It approached it gradually, through decisions that preserved authority in one region while weakening its coherence across another. This moment matters because it reveals how power can continue to function while already exceeding the conditions that made it effective. By the early 19th century, British authority had consolidated around a set of institutions that appeared capable of managing both maritime and territorial expansion. Parliament authorized policy, the Crown symbolized continuity, and administrative bodies like the East India Company extended governance into regions where direct oversight remained distant. Land forces secured territory, while naval dominance ensured the movement of goods and communication across oceans. Railways, telegraph lines, and colonial administrations began to form a network that connected distant provinces to decision-making centers in London. The map suggested cohesion. The structure suggested durability. Decisions moved outward from the metropole, translated into policy, and then into enforcement across regions that varied in terrain, population, and resistance. Authority appeared layered but unified. Each expansion reinforced the assumption that control could be extended indefinitely, provided sufficient infrastructure, and administrative adaptation followed. The empire did not lack mechanisms, it multiplied them. A directive issued in London could reorganize taxation across a province thousands of miles away, while local officials adjusted enforcement schedules based on seasonal movement and available manpower. The pattern did not break immediately. It repeated. Territory expanded, authority extended. Administrative complexity increased, but remained manageable within the existing framework. The cost of coordination rose, but not beyond the capacity of the system. Early signals of delay or misalignment were absorbed as temporary inefficiencies rather than structural warnings. Power interpreted its own strain as proof of scale, not as evidence of approaching constraint. As the empire extended deeper into continental interiors, particularly in regions like India and parts of Africa, the distance between decision and consequence began to widen. Communication improved, but not uniformly. Railways accelerated movement along fixed routes, but regions beyond those routes remained dependent on slower forms of transport. Telegraph lines transmitted information rapidly, but only along established corridors. Authority became unevenly distributed across space. Orders arrived on time in one district and weeks late in another. Enforcement varied, not by policy, but by geography. The system still functioned, but its synchronization began to fracture. Revenue expectations remained constant, while local conditions shifted unpredictably. Provincial administrators adjusted collection methods to compensate for delayed directives, creating minor deviations that accumulated across regions. At the center, these variations remained largely invisible. Reports aggregated outcomes without fully transmitting the conditions that produced them. Authority received confirmation of compliance, not the fragmentation of process. The system continued to expand its reach while losing clarity about its own operation. The expansion of land control required more than military presence. It required sustained administrative attention, logistical coordination, and the capacity to adapt policy to local conditions without losing coherence. Each new territory introduced variables that could not be fully standardized. Language, climate, economic structure, and existing social organization all required localized interpretation of central authority. Power responded by increasing layers of administration. More officials, more documentation, more procedural oversight. Each layer was designed to preserve authority across distance. Each layer also introduced delay. A policy debated in London might take months to be fully implemented in a remote province. By the time it was enforced, the conditions it was meant to address could already have shifted. Merchants adjusted supply routes in response to changing tariffs, while waiting for confirmation of policies that had already been revised at the center. The system did not fail. It adapted. But each adaptation increased its dependence on coordination that was becoming harder to maintain. Authority required not just control, but alignment. And alignment depended on timing, communication, and the ability to respond to change faster than conditions evolved. As expansion continued, the ratio between territory and coordination capacity began to shift. More land required more decisions, but the ability to process and implement those decisions did not scale at the same rate. Authority compensated by delegating more responsibility to local administrators, granting them discretion within defined limits. This preserved functionality in the short term. It also introduced variation in how authority was exercised. In one region, enforcement might be strict and immediate. In another, it might be delayed or negotiated. From the perspective of the center, both appeared as compliance. From the perspective of those governed, authority became inconsistent. Settlements adjusted expectations based on local enforcement patterns, aligning behavior not with policy itself, but with the timing and presence of authority. The empire continued to expand its administrative reach, but its internal coherence weakened. Decisions reinforced previous assumptions. That expansion required more structure, and more structure would restore alignment. But structure increased complexity. Complexity increased delay. Delay reduced the ability to respond to new conditions. Feedback loops extended. Information took longer to return to the center. By the time it arrived, it reflected a past condition. Authority made decisions based on data that no longer described the present. In moments of tension, such as local resistance or economic disruption, the system responded with increased assertion of control. More directives, more enforcement, more attempts to re-establish uniformity. These responses addressed symptoms, not the underlying constraint. Officials enforced policies with limited awareness of their broader context, while waiting for guidance that arrived too late to alter immediate conditions. The perception of control remained intact at the highest levels. Maps still expanded. Reports still confirmed compliance. The language of authority remained consistent, but beneath it, the conditions that made that authority effective were shifting. The empire had extended its reach across land to a point where coordination was no longer a background function. It had become the central constraint. Authority required synchronization across distances that could not be fully aligned. It required decisions that could be implemented uniformly, despite local variation. It required feedback that could arrive in time to inform action. These conditions had been achievable at smaller scales. At larger scales, they began to fail quietly. The system did not collapse. It continued to operate, but its capacity to adapt diminished. Each decision was made within a narrower set of viable options. Authority became reactive, not because it lacked power, but because it could no longer process its own environment fast enough to act preemptively. A decree intended to stabilize governance arrived in regions already operating under different conditions, reinforcing divergence rather than correcting it. Recognition did not arrive as a single moment. It emerged gradually as inconsistencies accumulated. Administrators encountered situations where existing policies no longer applied cleanly. Military presence secured territory, but did not guarantee administrative coherence. Infrastructure connected regions, but did not ensure alignment. Authority began to perceive its limits, but only within specific contexts. Each instance appeared manageable. Each deviation seemed correctable. The broader pattern remained obscured by the scale of operations. Control was still exercised. Decisions were still made. The system still functioned. But the space within which effective control could be maintained had narrowed. Land could be held. It could be governed, but not at the same level of coordination that had defined earlier expansion. The limit on land was not a boundary that could be marked on a map. It was a condition within the structure of authority itself. Power approached it not by losing territory, but by losing the ability to align that territory within a single coherent system. It continued to extend, even as the cost of maintaining coordination exceeded the capacity to sustain it. At the edges, authority remained visible. At the center, it remained confident. Between them, delay accumulated, variation increased, and the system adjusted in ways that preserved function while reducing coherence. And within that narrowing space, authority continued to act, still extending, still governing, still believing that expansion remained a function of will rather than a condition already constrained. If this reflection resonated with you, you can find more explorations like this on Timeless Questions, where history, power, and human nature quietly intersect.